Wade Franson is the host of Created in the Image of God, a series that examines the role of religion in society, from messianic returns to the emotive responses transmitted through our culture. Wade fearlessly addresses reality claims from all directions, objectively exploring their compatibility with Holy Scripture. Joining him is Daniel Sanderson, CEO of Planksip, an international philosophy and cultural media outlet, helping emerging thought leaders with personal branding by co-creating organic content. Tonight's episode, The Great Disappointment.
And we're live. Thank you, everybody, for joining us. I'm going to be talking about and introducing a really special guest for tonight's show. His name is Jay Tyson, and he is by far not the Great Disappointment, if everybody's tuning in to hear what that catchy title is all about. To get our bearing, let's just talk a little bit about Jay Tyson and his background. So Jay Tyson grew up just outside of Detroit, Michigan, and he graduated from Princeton University. Shortly thereafter, he married Eileen. And so I'm sure we'll ask about Eileen and hear a few nice stories. They moved to Liberia in West Africa. They stayed there for 4 years, and Jay worked on various different construction projects. There's a lot of background that has to do with some religious activities, but I think now is about the appropriate time to bring Jay into the studio. And we're going to go through this normal type of thing where we ask Jay about his upbringing and how religion influenced his formative years and how he got to where he is now. So Jay, why don't you come on into the stage and we'll introduce you to the audience. There he is.
All right. Well, thank you very much.
How are you doing, Jay?
I'm fine, thank you. As far as my background, I grew up, our family was a member of the Presbyterian Church in Birmingham, Michigan, and we were regular attendees. So as a child, I heard all the stories from the Old Testament, stories, of course, about Noah and Abraham and Moses, and then, of course, the stories about Jesus from the New Testament. And even as a young child, I wondered why it was that God spoke to mankind through these messengers. It seemed like on a regular basis, but now it had been 2,000 years or almost 2,000 years. We had not heard from him. So I was always kind of wondering about why that was and whether we shouldn't expect something. Now, my particular church was not very strong on the issues of the return of Christ. They kind of felt that when we died, that's when we returned to Christ. And so there wasn't much emphasis on the prophetic aspects of the New Testament. But I always had a curiosity. And actually, I was a member of the youth group in our church when our minister felt that we should know about other religions. And so that's when I started to, a little exploration of some of the other religions. And that led me to where I am today, I guess I can say. And long story short, I wound up heading out from the Birmingham, Bloomfield area in order to go to college at Princeton. And directly after college, as you mentioned, went to do construction work in West Africa, then some years in historic restoration in Haifa, Israel, and then back to the U.S. for raising our 2 daughters.
Interesting. So I'm not going to delve into it too much, but I'd like you to give a bit of a hint about what the Great Disappointment is. Just a hint, because we're really we're gonna pull Wade into the conversation. So, like, let's build some tension about what this disappointment is all about. This Great Disappointment.
All right. Well, there were expectations in the early 1800s that Christ would return. And there are several reasons, several references in the Bible that seem to have been fulfilled. They seem to provide indications that Christ would return. And in particular, one fellow who was not himself a trained minister, but had a strong interest in religion, he started to investigate the Bible for himself. And he followed Jesus's instruction. In Matthew 24, when the disciples ask, "When are you going to return?" one of the things that Jesus says is, refer to the prophecies of Daniel. So William Miller did that, and he went back to a particular pair of prophecies that seemed to be speaking of the further future. One of them refers to the cutting off of the Messiah, suggesting the death of the Messiah, and he predicted the number of years between an event in his lifetime and the crucifixion of Jesus, and that was perfectly accurate. And the second prophecy spoke of 2,300 years. And if you're starting at the same place as the first prophecy and coming forward 2,300 years, that brings you exactly to the year 1844. So because of that, he explained this. It was fairly clear to everybody. Seemed perfectly logical. The prophecy was exactly right concerning the crucifixion of Jesus. And so naturally, one would expect that the prophecy about the 2,300 years would also be perfectly correct. Yet they were expecting Christ to return from the sky, and they focused on a particular day. When that day came and went, and there was no visible Christ descending from the skies, it became known as the Great Disappointment. And it was a great disappointment because so many people, he had like 500,000 interested followers. And in the early or mid 1800s, that was a pretty sizable amount in America. Some of them were so certain that Christ would return that they hadn't bothered to plant crops because there was no need to, harvest crops next year because there was not going to be a next year, or they were all going to be in heaven next year. Many of them had sold all the things that they owned. So it was really a very bitter disappointment to all those people who had this great expectation.
I chuckled to myself because that's quite the hint. No, but that's okay. It's all right. It's good. That's good. So like I'm a non-academic philosopher, and I want to kind of throw a curveball at you. This idea of years in terms of timeline for the return of Christ, is it possible, and would it still be viewed as accurate if the equivocation of years was just different than our calendar years? Like, we ultimately wouldn't know that, right? So the idea I had the other day was, if there's a natural progression of man that somehow gets contaminated with technology, things are sped up quite dramatically. So maybe could you imagine that the time scale for years were actually condensed and skewed somehow, so the prophetic 1 year doesn't quite equal 1 year kind of thing? Or am I completely off basis? Or how would the church or religion handle that kind of a discrepancy?
Well, that's an interesting question. One of the things I discovered in my research was that the angel Gabriel is mentioned only 4 times in the Bible, twice in the New Testament, twice in the Old Testament. The 2 times in the New Testament have to do with the prediction to Zechariah that his son John, who became John the Baptist, would be born. Angel Gabriel was perfectly accurate in that regard. His prediction that to Mary that Jesus would be born, his prediction was perfectly accurate in that regard. The other 2 times that Gabriel is mentioned are both in the book of Daniel, and they have to do with these 2 prophecies. The one prophecy about it's termed 70 weeks. These are known as, again, according to standard biblical interpretation, a divine day is actually a year in man's counting. So 70 weeks, 490 days is equivalent to 490 years in human terminology. And that was perfectly accurate. That was, I mean, from the time, and he specifies this particular time that this prophecy began. And that time, because it's linked to an event of one of the kings of the Persian Empire, that time is known to historians. So it was pretty clearly focused as to when it began. So then the question becomes, if Gabriel was accurate in these three prophecies, wouldn't it make sense that he would be accurate in the same way in the fourth one? I mean, there's no real reason to believe that there should be some kind of a change in methodology or anything like that. So that's why, people were so clear. And it's kind of interesting that William Miller was not actually the first one to predict the year 1844. There were others earlier who had come to the same conclusion, but of course they were so much earlier that it wasn't going to happen in their lifetime, and so it didn't generate a whole lot of public interest. William Miller came to this conclusion in 1831, so this is like just 13 years before the event is due to occur. So that helped to focus people's attention.
Okay, well, you know what? You've redeemed yourself because you've brought in some good tension into this equation, and I'm happy to bring Wade into the conversation right after a commercial break. I'm going to leave the two of you alone, though. So take it easy on Wade, okay? He's a sensitive man, right? So he needs lots of love, okay? And so we're going to go to a commercial break, and when we come back, it's going to be you and Wade. And I'll see you a little bit later in the show. Thanks, Jay.
All right, thank you.
In a world increasingly disoriented and lacking spiritual values, many are turning to religion as a source of inspiration and comfort. Each person chooses their individual path, and if there is one thing we are known for, it's providing a positive platform for diverse points of view, to provide each of us the opportunity to discern truth for ourselves. Something or Other Publishing is proud to announce the creation of Royal Falcon Press imprint to feature the unparalleled talent of multiple writers who will bring uplifting and thought-provoking contributions to the body of religious literature, offering current spiritual insights and practical solutions to the challenges we face. Let's grow together as one of the most substantial spiritual communities on the internet. Register and explore a new way to achieve universal wisdom and reinforce your faith with all the surprises Royal Falcon Press has in store for you.
Jay, it's so good to see you here.
It's good to be here.
And you're also just back from an international trip, one that wasn't all that pleasant for you in some ways. Tell us a bit about that.
Yeah. So one of my daughters fell in love with a young man from India, and subsequently they married in 2014. We had the wedding in India. We traveled to India for it because it was easier for us to go from America than for his family to come here. So that marriage has gone very well. Unfortunately, my son-in-law's father passed away just a couple of weeks ago. And according to Indian tradition, it is important not only that the daughter-in-laws should attend, but also that the father of the daughter-in-law who attended the wedding should also attend the funeral services. So on short notice, I was called to get on a plane and head off to India with my daughter and their two children. And my son-in-law had gone ahead, actually. So that was a little interruption to our plans for late May and early June, but I'm back now.
And so condolences there. And but this obviously, as Dan introduced you, not your first international trip. You've spent quite a bit of time outside the U.S., largely due to your professional career as a structural engineer, or is there a different term for it?
Civil engineer
Civil engineer.
includes structural, but includes other things as well.
And how did that degree background serve you in what led to you being on this show, which is that you're an author with twin books that are really quite amazing. The depth of research that was performed and the way in which you wove the themes together. So tell us a little bit about how those international experiences and your training as a civil engineer helped you in conducting the research and writing those books.
Well, I guess I would say that my interest as an engineer also kind of connects with geography, knowing where things are and how they're connected. But it was really in 2012 that I took a particular interest in learning about William Miller. I was coming home from a trip to Maine, and I stopped in at the William Miller farm, which is on the border between Vermont and New York. I say in New York, but close to Vermont. And I heard the story, and I was very impressed. I mean, I had heard in general about his predictions, but I was impressed by the sincerity of his search. He was not a self-promoter by any means. In fact, even though he had come to these conclusions about when Christ should return, he did not at first want to publicize it at all. In fact, there's an interesting story about how he finally told God, look, I'm not going to go out and talk about this unless someone comes and asks me to. And don't you know, within an hour, there was a fellow who had come from a nearby town who had heard of William Miller and his ideas. His church minister was ill or was out of town or something, and they needed a replacement minister for that weekend. So they asked him to come and preach, and he kicked himself. He said, I had told God that I wouldn't do anything unless someone came and asked me. And don't you know, within an hour, somebody did.
Yeah.
So he was kind of dragged into this and somewhat kicking and screaming, you might say. And that's not a typical self-promoter who's trying to advance his own positions or his own fame or anything like that. So I was very impressed by that story. But I also knew that other religions in other parts of the world were expecting the fulfillment of their prophecies, of their promised one coming at the same time, generally around the same period. And so I was wondering how one might connect the story of what was going on in the West, in America and Europe in 1844, with what was going on in the East. And
before you go there, let's take a step back and talk about the buildup in the U.S. Because we had the first Great Awakening, the Second Great Awakening, I think they were called, in the early 1800s, and then, or even as early as the 1730s and 40s, right?
Yes.
And then, so tell us a little bit about that backdrop, right? The coming out of the Enlightenment, most people know that religion began to recede, right? As biblical scholars, even biblical scholars, but also others began to question religious dogma and began to see that religious dogma had contributed to the Dark Ages. And now the Enlightenment was happening and people were awakening through science and whatnot, and religion was taking a back seat. But there were also those who, through the Enlightenment, began to experience an increase in religious fervor and an interest in studying more deeply and taking a fresh look at those scriptures. Tell us a little bit about that sort of backdrop to William Miller appearing then in the early 1800s.
Yeah, so the First Great Awakening was focused primarily on the idea that each person was responsible for their own spiritual progress. Prior to that, certainly as a member of Catholic Church, it was the priests that were responsible. All that a person had to do was go take communion and listen to the Mass. But people began to think more and more that they have to be responsible for their own spiritual progress. Part of this was that books were now available. The Bible was now available, ever since Gutenberg had made it possible to mass print copies of the Bible and other religious literature. So that was the first Great Awakening. That kind of subsided in the late 1700s. Deism was common in that place, the idea that God kind of started the universe and just let it go from there. But in the early 1800s, the idea of Christ's return was sparked partly because Jesus had given instructions to his disciples to take the gospel to all nations, and that when they had done that, that would be the time for him to return. And people realized
Matthew 18:14, maybe, if I remember it.
Matthew 24,
24:14.
14, yes, exactly.
And this gospel shall be preached unto the world as a witness, and then shall the end come.
Exactly. So that just really pinpointed it. And they said, well, look, we've sailed, especially the British, other countries as well, but especially the British Empire had carried the gospel to all the nations that was part of its empire. The Spanish, of course, and the Portuguese had carried it to South America, and the Dutch had carried it to the East Indies, excuse me. And so, at that time, it was felt that, well, we had done what Jesus has asked us to do. And so, now's the time we should expect him to return. So that was one indication. Another indication was that there are several references in the Old Testament. Probably the most consistent prophecy in the Old Testament is that the Messiah will come when the Jews return to the Holy Land. And the Jews were beginning to return to the Holy Land based on a prophecy in the Zohar, which is the Jewish book of mysticism. So a big movement had started as early as 1808, and they were expecting the Messiah to appear in the year 1840, which is the year 5600 in the Jewish calendar. So a lot of people started to return. The majority of people in Jerusalem by that year were Jewish. So this long prophecy, for centuries, even millennia, I guess you could say, really, since the Romans had forced the Jewish people out of Jerusalem in the early 2nd century.
And this brings up the concept of the times of the Gentiles, right? Jerusalem will be trodden underfoot by non-Jewish elements, and then there are ways to distinguish between some of these prophetic timelines, but they all point to, let's say, 1840-ish time frames, and there's some give and take there. But William Miller's prophecies were very precise. His first prediction, from my recollection, after he was forced by others to put a date, he staunchly refused to put a date to this.
To exact day of the year. That's true. Yes.
Yeah. When he then was asked to do it, his first one was, I believe, May 21st or March. Was it March 21st or May 21st?
March 21st.
March 21st, 1843.
Yeah, that was true, and that was based on a reference in the Old Testament to the fact that the Jewish people were allowed to return to Jerusalem on the first day of the year. And the Zoroastrian year, they were leaving Zoroastrian Persia. So first day of the Zoroastrian year was the spring equinox. So that would have been March 21st. So that was the first feeling. And he said March 21st, 1843, or it could be March 21st, 1844, because he recognized that there was a little bit of a problem with the year zero when you do the counting. As I think we all know, Roman numerals did not have a zero in them.
Right. So, interestingly, who brought us the year zero? Where did that come from?
That comes from what we today call the Arabic numeral system, which actually originated in India, but it got transferred from the Arabs, from the Indians to the Arabs, and then eventually it got transferred into Europe by a young man who studied at an Arabic university, and then when he went back to Europe, he eventually became Pope. And as Pope, he was, he loved the Arabic numeral system. As Pope, he had the authority to say, we're getting rid of the Roman numeral system. We're going to use the Arabic numeral system. So
some know that I have sort of a fascination with the city of Bab El and the Tower of Babel, and the story about the confusion of the languages. And the analogy I like to use is this was like the smashing of a clay pot with the pieces strewn across the planet, with different peoples having different pieces of the grand puzzle. So I want to circle back to something that Dan mentioned while I was in the behind stage listening in, about the year, right? Could a year perhaps have a different context? Could have been stretched over time or shrunk over time through different concepts. But we've got and then my phone rang. So if you guys covered this, I missed it. We've got the Jewish year, which is a lunar calendar. We've also got the year in Islam, which is a lunar year as well, with a different number of months and a different way of calculating the years. So how does that play? And then we've got the prophetic method, in which God says for prophecy purposes, he often takes a day for a year. And then he talks about prophecies in the terms of X number of days. And then you have to interpret each day for a year in counting prophecies, right? This is something that William Miller dealt with. What are your comments on that sort of mix of ideas that I've thrown in there about different lengths of years with different numbers of days, and then counting prophecy by counting a year for each day?
Yeah, it's kind of fascinating because if you are to use the number of days in the lunar year, which I think is somewhere around 354, and the number of days in a solar year, 365 and a quarter, if you average them, the average comes out to be almost exactly 360. And so whenever we talk in prophetic terms about a year that is equal to 360 days, 42 months, counting 30 days per month. So that makes the calculations a little easier. They don't bother to get into the fractions. But the Jewish year, of course, is a lunar solar year. In other words, adjustments are made for the fact that the lunar count is shorter.
Because they use the seasons. The calendar has to be kept in sync with the seasons, right? Mm-hmm. Winter, spring, summer, and fall, and the harvest cycle. So as the calendar gets out of sync, they throw another month in there in the Jewish cycle to keep it in sync with the solar year, right? Is that how it works?
Yes, that's correct. And in the Islamic system, you're short a few days, as I mentioned, so that roughly every 33 years, you have to count on 34 of the shorter Muslim years. So it's very close to 3 years per century difference.
So all of this is rather arcane, but it really highlights the dedication and diligence, and to a degree brilliance, of William Miller, as we'll find out later, to come to this year of 1844. So I'm going to go now to another commercial break, because this next commercial break is actually an ad for your book, Jay, your first book. What's the title of that?
The Wise Men of the West.
And why did you choose that title?
Because I thought it was interesting that the wise men of the East, the story of the wise men of the East in the Bible, is the one main example of successful prophecy, where the wise men were able to follow prophecies and successfully find Jesus at his birth, in this case. So I thought, well, maybe what would it have been like if people from the West had decided to go out and search, much the way the wise men from the East decided to go out and search. And in the process of searching, they discover that the William Miller part of the story is just the tip of the iceberg.
And what is the genre of your book?
So we call this historical fiction. because the main characters and their movements are fictional, but it is surrounded by history. It's constantly referring to historical fact. And even the epilogue at the end of the second book ties everything together by being entirely nonfiction. But sometimes I say it's like like the movie Titanic. You know, the story of Jack and Rose was fictional, but they were surrounded by all kinds of historic, real things that happened. So it gives you an opportunity to see not just, you know, kind of the picture from above, but what it was actually like to be there in the middle of the situation. So that's why I
I'm
enjoy
laughing
that.
now because I live on the very edge of Dane County. I'm still within Dane County after moving last year. And the statement about Dane County, which is in Wisconsin, was always 70 square miles surrounded by reality, right? So you struck a note there. So that's, of course, politically speaking. However, we're going to now play an ad for your book. And I see we have, you know, quite a few in the audience here. No one's chatting yet. They're probably all in awe of your mastery of history and the tension that Dan, you know, began to build in the audience. And we're going to have some reveals here coming up. But the first reveal is that this ad that we're playing of your book is also the giveaway for today. So you folks in the audience, you know, get in there, provide your questions, provide your comments, because we're going to be giving a copy of Jay's book away to the person whose comment Jay finds the most intriguing, entertaining, valuable, thought-provoking, or whatever. He's going to get to choose. And what you're going to get is the book that we're about to advertise with this next clip. So we don't have a link below, but we do have a QR code. And that QR code is something you can hold up with your phone, and you can just order it that way. We hope you will order it. And I've been instructed to place the link in the chat so that people can order the book from the chat as well. So I'm going to be multitasking here in a moment to do that, but I'm going to leave that QR code up for a moment. So Jay, I'm going to start the reveals now. First by saying that longtime listeners know that my religious background was in a group that was very intensely, unlike the Presbyterians, very intensely focused on the return of Jesus. And we were very aware of William Miller and his work. And we also recognized those prophecies, and we knew why those prophecies pointed to 1844. We could do the math. But obviously, like those in the Great Disappointment, we hadn't seen Jesus. He didn't seem to be anywhere. So we were continuing to look, and some people were saying that we were setting dates. Some would say we never set dates. It's debatable as to whether we did set dates or not. But tell us a little bit about your visit to the actual house that William Miller was in, and the initial stages of writing that book.
Yeah, so as I said, I stopped by there just to kind of see in person what I had read about. And I got a wonderful explanation of William Miller's history. And I was so impressed by the fact that he was not a big self-promoter. He kind of got dragged into this kicking and screaming, as I mentioned earlier. So, you know, I left there thinking about how amazing it was that this was going on in 1844 in the US, but I also knew that something else was going on in another part of the world, in the East. Um, and I guess I got busy with other things, and it was probably about 9 months later that I was returning from my home in Michigan, my parents' home, after we had to close it down and sell it after my mother moved into a nursing home. I was coming home in a rental truck, bringing some furniture back, and I started to think about this issue of how could we make a story that would connect what was going on in the West in the 1840s with what was going on in the East. And it occurred to me that you could perhaps make a story about a traveler who knew about what was going on in the East, in the West, and then traveled to the East and discovered things as he went. And interestingly enough, a few minutes after I thought that thought, the steering wheel on the truck I was driving started to shake violently. And I kind of panicked, and I pulled the truck off to the side, and I called the rental company, who called the nearest mechanic shop, and the mechanic came out and towed the truck into the shop. And I waited for maybe 20 minutes or so, and he came out and he said, "Well, I've got good news and I've got bad news. The good news is I know exactly what the problem is and how to fix it. The bad news is that the part that we need won't be able to get here until tomorrow morning at the earliest." So suddenly I had 24 hours of time on my hands, and all I really had was a pad of paper and a pencil. And so I started to chart out the general ideas of this story. And it stuck with me. I did a lot of research. I found out a lot more. Lots of pieces of the puzzle kind of came together. And I learned a lot more about what the other religions at this time in the mid 1800s were expecting as far as the coming of their promised one. So I wove this all into a story of a fellow by the name of Zach Thompson traveling eastward, picking up a friend from England, James Lawrence. And then as they travel further and meet people, not only of their own religion, but of other religions, they learn step by step the whole story. And so by the time they get back, they realize that this story of what William Miller had learned was just the beginning of a much bigger story. And anyone who reads the book, by the time they're finished with volume 2, will have the full story.
Now, a pivotal turning point of this question of William Miller is found, interestingly, in a Telegraph Message. And full disclosure, and part of the ongoing reveal here, you and I are both Baha'is, and that Telegraph Message is a significant moment that is often cited by the Baha'is. Tell us a little about that first Telegraph Message, and why should anyone care about a telegraph message? What is the potential significance of that from a prophetic perspective?
Well, the message was, "What hath God wrought?" And so,
and where did that come from?
So,
why did Samuel Morse? Where did he get that from?
So that comes from the Bible. I think it's Book of Numbers 23. Is that?
Yep.
And yeah. So.
But why did he pick that? What's the circumstance behind that being the content of the first Telegraph Message?
Well,
was it his niece, or?
Yes, it was a relative who selected it, and exactly, whether she was motivated in a dream or what, but somehow she selected that. And it is so interesting because this really represents the birth of the electrical age. Prior to that, all that was known about electricity was that You had static electricity, you had lightning bolts, you had Benjamin Franklin flying a kite in a thunderstorm, but not a whole lot more was known about electricity. And so now, for the first time,
but in the Bible,
Mhm.
there's something related to electricity with regard to the return of Jesus. What is that?
Well, yes, that's true. Jesus does say that uh, as the lightning which comes out of the east and shines far to the west, so shall be the coming of the Son of Man. So he gives us this clue there that the coming of the Son of Man will be from the east, and the news will move to the west. And it strikes me particularly that in the east, it will strike as a lightning bolt. And the west, it would be more or less the rumbling of the thunder. Um,
Well,
and
what I'm thinking is that electricity,
mhm,
lightning is electricity, isn't it? It's
mhm,
electricity, and the telegraph message was sent via electricity, an
exactly.
electrical charge or impulse through a line, and that line, didn't it travel from east to west?
Yeah, I guess from Washington to Baltimore, as I understand it. So, yeah, it certainly helped connect the East and the West. Um, it was very easy to set up these telegraph lines right along the railroads. The railroad system was also blossoming at that time. It was a very easy thing to put up a series of poles and wires while you were laying the railroad tracks. And in a short time, I think it was 1866, so less than 20 years later, they had already laid cables across the Atlantic Ocean, and now they could speak, they could contact Europe directly, instantaneously, instead of having to wait for messages to come on ships. And within another 20 years, India, Australia, and China were all connected. And suddenly, this neural network of electronic communication really started to blossom. When we think about the modern age, I mean, we cannot imagine the modern age without this kind of instantaneous communication.
So that we won't dive more deeply into it, but that lightning bolt image, the electrical impulse that went through the first telegraph message. And by the way, President Lincoln used telegraph messages in the Civil War a few years later, and he called them lightning messages. Right? The full text of Numbers 23, verse 23 is, surely there is no, this is from the ESV. What's the ESV? English Standard Version, maybe.
Mm-hmm.
There are, of course, many translations of the Bible. I just randomly Googled and what is Numbers 23:23, and it suggested this translation. Surely there is no enchantment against Jacob, nor any divination against Israel. Now it shall be said of Jacob and Israel, what has God wrought? What hath God wrought? Another translation I read started out, from this day it shall be said of Israel. From this day. What was that day of that telegraph message?
So that was May 24th, 1844.
And there were some other events that happened on that day that I think you talk about and unveil in your book. In this case, I want to highlight a perspective that this was the end of the times of the Gentiles. In 1844, the Ottoman Empire was issuing edicts called the Edicts of Toleration. I think they started in 1843 and 1844, encouraging further Jewish settlement, allowing land ownership. These things were happening, and of course, students of prophecy realize that certainly one interpretation is that when Jesus returns, he would reestablish the Jews in the Holy Land. You already highlighted the fact that migration of the Jews was beginning earlier, but this message seemed to signify a certain point in time.
Yeah, it is interesting that up until that time, the Jewish communities there had to rely on donations from their home communities because they were not allowed to own land. They could not, therefore, have any really established business. They couldn't earn a living, basically. So they had to rely on donations. And of course, that strongly limits the number of people who can go there. But once they could own land and start opening their own businesses, then they got a real foothold. And that really opened the door to having more Jewish people from around the world come and settle in the Holy Land.
So when we look at biblical prophecy, I'm going to take a couple of steps back here. From the mists of ancient times, we have those opening stories in the book of Genesis, right? Our co-host Dan and I were talking earlier. I don't know if we want to continue this conversation later in the show, probably not, but talking about the stories around, for example, Noah and the Nephilim, I believe it was. Mm-hmm. And from these stories, we have carried forward even prehistory, right? The first man and woman in the Garden of Eden. Now, some interpretations of that align with the Jewish timeline of history, which, as you mentioned earlier, was 5,600. That correlates quasi to this 6,000 years. And this, on the one hand, we have a day equals a year. And then on the other hand, we have a day equals 1,000 years with God, right? So you have these different ways of looking at time. So it's actually quite interesting that Dan was raising that question. And that's one reason why people interpret 6,000 years. But my point is this: when you start going back tens of thousands and even hundreds of thousands of years into human history, and the first concepts that were being raised and the first oral traditions, and when we began to see writing emerge, the language and the concepts that existed were very different. Even the concept of a year, as documented by the Jews and the Muslims, was different from a lunar versus a solar. So you have this kind of swampy situation when you try to look at prophecy, and there are all kinds of different ways of looking at it. But what was recorded, nonetheless, was so accurate in another sense that William Miller was able to divine 1844 as a year. And then you have these other things impacting, and lo and behold, you now have the emergence of a Jewish state, which is the manifestation of something that is recorded practically on every page of the Bible. The entire Bible could be said to have been filtered through a Jewish sensibility around their national narrative and their national destiny, and the symbols and tokens of their belief in their covenant with God, which they maintained. And there's that famous prayer that the Jews pray, and the toast that they make at Passover next year in Jerusalem, which has carried them forward through history, and also perversely allowed them to be identified as a unique people by Hitler in World War II. You have the emergence of the Holocaust, which further then cemented the need, the desire of a Jewish homeland, and the establishment of a Jewish state in 1948 coming out of the Holocaust. So that's a big, long chunk of narrative. But what I want to say, interestingly, to tie this up with a bow, is that was it you that mentioned deists, or Dan that mentioned deists?
Yeah, I did.
Being the belief that God started things and then is hands off. There's an element of deism to this narrative that I'm weaving, in which I believe God is more hands-on than the deists would suggest, but he's also incredibly hands-off to allow these different formulations of years, these different formulations of language, these different concepts to emerge from Jewish and Muslim history. And the way in which I view all of this happening from a prophetic perspective is simply to know that God exists outside of time and space. Therefore, he knows all of human history. I mean, Einstein, sort of popularized this concept of space-time and the idea that you could exist outside it if you were a divine being or outside the universe, you could see all of space-time, forwards, backwards, upside down. So this divine being knew all this, and he introduced these ideas into the thinking of humankind at key points in history, but in the language and concepts available to them at that time. So prophecy is simply history written in advance, but you don't take a 20th century history book and transport it back in time and deliver it to Cro-Magnon, right? You have to deliver the inklings of that future prophetic outcome in the concepts of the people of that time. And that's why other people posit aliens having done that, because they can see the kind of logic in that. You think of 2001: A Space Odyssey, right? And the initial scene of the obelisk and the chimpanzees and whatnot. So I've just spoken a lot of words and woven this narrative. What's your take on the unfolding of prophecy throughout time, and how this, maybe this even ties into what you're doing with your historical fiction approach to it?
Yeah, so it's kind of been an interesting experience being an author of a novel, because one of the things I learned is that if you've written 90% of it, 95% of it, and you realize that something needs to be changed, you can go back and you can introduce an idea early on, and then that idea might filter through the story and become very significant later on.
There you go.
And
a good writing class will always say, look, if you describe the room in the opening scene and there's a gun above the mantelpiece, you better darn well be sure that gun gets used before the story is over.
Yeah, exactly. So the fact that as an author, you exist outside of the time and space of your book, and if you want to change it, you can go back and make some adjustments and whatever. So, God is the author of this world, and he works things out. He's seen everything. He knows the end from the very beginning. So yeah, I've learned a lot in that regard.
And then, of course, you have the raging debate between free will and determinism and destiny and fate. That's for another show. What we're going to do right now is quickly go, since we're talking about authors and existing outside of time and space and the creative power of an author, we're going to do a little promotion for the publishing company, Something or Other Publishing, that is a sponsor. And then we're going to bring Dan back in the studio to kind of help us wrap this up. Dan being also the sponsor of the show, co-sponsor, and the founder of his own platform for authors and others to help promote themselves and their work. So we'll go to this promotion, and then we'll bring Dan back. And stay tuned, everyone. I'm seeing a few comments, but we still need some more poignant ones so that Jay can pick one and give a copy of his book away. Stay tuned.
And welcome to Something or Other Publishing, or as our friends like to call us, Soup. Soup is a platform that connects authors, readers, and service providers in one convenient place. Choose Soup if you're an author with a great book idea and you're looking for a publisher offering hands-on coaching and some of the best royalties in the business. Or if you're a reader who enjoys engaging with celebrated and emerging authors. We already have over 3,000 of them, and more are joining every day. You can even win free books by voting on their book ideas. Or maybe you're a service provider and you're looking to engage with over 3,000 authors. We're here to help. So whether you're an author, a reader, or a service provider, you're in the right place at Soup. Contact us at help@soupllc.com to learn more.
Or scan that QR code. Welcome back, Dan. What have you been pondering as you listen to us talk about biblical prophecy from your vantage point back behind the studio?
Well, I like to take more of an infant approach to it, as I mentioned today, and it's actually I beg of you guys to almost allow me to be a child in that sort of sense, because I've I've recently come to the conclusion that I'm a secular believer. And as you start to ponder that word well of secular and believer, um, you can kind of think of the word believer in a couple different I felt ways, right? Is he a believer, or what does it mean? What is the nature of the belief that he's actually referring to? And so I think Wade and I have talked enough to know that I try and reconcile it from a beauty standpoint and from a metaphorical standpoint. So sometimes when you guys fly at a frequency that I can't do the metaphorical. My brain can't do it quite as fast as you guys are kind of laying down the tracks. And instead of being critical about it, I try and think, okay, we have two grown men, really intelligent men here, that didn't get to that point in their life without some serious thinking and contemplation. So I trust and I believe that you guys are heartfelt and really truly believe what you guys are talking about. So I want to be enlightened and understand all the nuances of that beautiful vignette that you guys are explaining and feeling, right? And so probably the best place to start on that is like the inspiration. What's something that's inspired both of you, or maybe because it's Jay's the guest on the show. I think I'll throw that to Jay. Like, help bridge the three of us in this conversation. Like, where are you seeing the strongest pull of inspiration from telling this story, telling your novel, authoring something, mimicking what the creator would be doing on a grand scale? Tell me about the inspiration and the wisdom that you derive. That's what I'm really interested in.
Yeah, I think I can answer that and also address Fouad's most recent comment about could these potential prophecies just be luck? I think one of the strongest evidences has to do with prophecy that references that you find both in the book of Daniel and in the book of Revelation to the number 1260. 1260, whether it's years or sometimes referred to as 42 months, sometimes referred to as a times and the dividing of times, that is 3.5 years. It's a fascinating number. It's
prophetic days, right?
Yeah, it's the only one that appears both in the Old Testament and the New Testament. Okay. And so a lot of people have speculated as to how it fits in to modern day prophetic fulfillment. Now, when my characters go to the Middle East, they are surprised to find out that the year 1844 is, in the Islamic calendar, the year 1260. I mean, what are the chances of that? It's either one chance out of 1844.
Fouad, do the odds on that. What are the odds on just that one little thing?
Yeah, I mean, to me, that just seems impossible that this could just be coincidence. And then when you look further, the first thought might be, well, maybe.
Jay, I have to ask a question, and I'm not going to derail it because it's not. This isn't to prove you wrong. I don't get the light bulb that you're seeing in the coincidence. So please explain to me.
So 1260 definitely had something to do with prophecy in the Old Testament and the New Testament. William Miller commented on this. It wasn't exactly clear from his comments. He had some theories about how it might fit in. He never studied Islam. Christians in the early 1800s typically wouldn't study Islam. And yet, when my characters get to the Middle East, they find out not only is it the year 1260, but also there's certainly a portion of the community that expects the promised one to come in the year 1260. And one
you broke up there, Jay. So let me make that point for Dan. In Islam, the year 1260 was also the year in which the 12th Imam was supposed to return.
Right. Yeah. So And some people might say, well, did the Muslims believe that there was something special that happened in the year 1260 because they studied the Bible? Well, it turns out when you look into it, no, it was an entirely different prophecy coming from the Quran. And it was just, I mean, some people say, oh, well, it's coincidental that these two major prophecies both happen to be focusing on the exact same year. And the 12, and again, the Muslim calendar is a lunar calendar, so the years shift. But in 1260, it turns out that almost entirely, like 98% of the year 1260, falls within the Christian year 1844. I mean, it started in late January, it ended in late December or something like that. So, the overlap is striking itself. So that's, that to me is an evidence that there was some intelligence that exists from way back a long time ago that could synchronize these things. And of course, because certain Muslims were looking for the promised one, and they were focused on that particular year. And interestingly enough, when the Baha'i faith began with the declaration of the Bab, he was in the ancient biblical land of Elam. Okay, he was in the city of Shiraz. It's known as Elam in the Bible, and it's very close to the same place that Daniel saw his vision about the 2,300 days. So Daniel, a lot of people, if they don't know the Bible very well, they think, oh, Daniel, yeah, he was in the Holy Land, right? No, he was not in the Holy Land. He was part of the Jews who were taken into exile by the Babylonians and continued to live there under the Persians once the Persians took over Babylon. So he was having this vision of the 2,300 days, and it turns out that it was very close geographically to the place where it would be fulfilled in 1844. So, I mean, you can say coincidence, but after a while, one has to say, this looks like more than coincidence.
Allow me to jump in here, because I want to address a different aspect of this, right? And so, for those who don't know, Jay just brought up the Bab, right? The Bab, who is, as he said, let's just call it first big cornerstone in what we call the Baha'i faith. Mm-hmm. His name means gate, right? And he declared that he was the gate of God, which in Akkadian is Bab El. So you have the city Bab El, and the Bab is known as the primal point. And he would begin the process of reuniting mankind and establishing one language, which is the sort of undoing of what God called Babel, or the Tower of Babel. So the point is, you've got all these puzzle pieces, this complexity, and my perspective is that, so if Fuad is a skeptic, he might truly be a skeptic, or he might be angling for, the most intelligent comment to get a free copy of Jay's book. I'm not sure what Fuad's motivation is for his particular comments, which are very interesting. But my point is, for truly the skeptic, God will not allow himself to be proven or to be held to be found by the doubters. I remember when I was a minister, I gave a sermon on the subject of doubt. And a doubt can never be answered. Remember when you were a kid and you said, I doubt it, I doubt it, I doubt it, right? A doubt cannot be answered. So the thing for those who really are seeking is to turn your doubt into a question and then seek that answer. Of course, this isn't sufficient at all for the skeptic or for the doubter. To say that, well, God will not allow himself to be found by those who doubt that he is, right? But I would point to Hebrews chapter 11, in which faith is the evidence of things not seen. and the substance of things hoped for. So and then it says, he that would come to God must believe that he is, and that he is a rewarder of those who diligently seek him. So God says, in order for you to find me, you must first believe in me, and you must believe that I'm good. If you don't believe that I'm good, and you don't believe that I exist, I will allow you to continue in that. God, this is in my view, the generosity and the mercifulness of God. Because if God revealed himself fully, as it says so repeatedly in the Bible, we would cease to exist, right? We couldn't remotely continue to stand in that presence. So God wants us to have free will. We talked about that earlier. I said for another show. We are intended to have free will. We are intended to be able to choose to believe in God or choose to deny that he exists. And we have to be given that freedom. Therefore, God cannot impose himself upon us. He cannot impose himself on the doubter by having the doubter painted into a corner and absolutely remove all ability to doubt. To be exposed to that kind of power and force, we would cease to exist. So we're given that space, we're given that freedom. That's my take on it.
Yeah, if I could just add, I think of life as an individual and life as humanity, and our free will as kind of like a guy in a canoe or a kayak who's going down a river. Okay, as you go down the river, you can choose whether you're going to go through the rapids or whether you're going to go through calmer areas, whether you're going to bounce off of rocks or not. There's a certain amount of choice. However, there are also the rocks at the bottom of the river and along the sides. And so there are some things that don't give. We don't have the option of pushing the rocks aside. But we do have a certain amount of options, and they can affect whether we go through life in a difficult way or a less difficult way.
The School of Hard Rocks.
Yeah, the School of Hard Rocks. There you go.
Here's one for you, Dan, from our friend Fuad, who's definitely going to be hard to beat in terms of getting that free book.
Okay, this is a Greek concept. If you view God in all his glory, you would die. There's a Greek
recognize
concept.
That being a resident Greek scholar.
There's a Greek concept.
Well,
now in all his glory, you would die.
In the Baha'i faith, there is a concept that if you viewed, and I don't know if it's God, it's like all of the next world, you would kill yourself in order to get there, because it's so glorious. But since we have a purpose in this world, and killing ourselves, shortening our lives in order to get to the next world more quickly, does not achieve that purpose. So we have a certain veil pulled over us, and we don't see the next world in all its glory. But
why would you want to be here in this mess? Right?
Exactly.
Here's another great comment from Extended Clips, although I think we gave him a book last week or promised him one. This is a Baha'i perspective not recognized by the majority Sunni Orthodox faction. This is absolutely correct, but it's not a Baha'i perspective, right? It comes from Shia Islam. So it's a Shia perspective that the Baha'is are aware of. Is that correct?
Yeah, and I should mention, though, that the Sunnis at that time had a general expectation that of course, they don't believe so much in the return of the 12th Imam, because that's not part of Sunni Islam, but they believe in the return of Christ, and they believe that would happen sometime in the middle of the 13th century, that is the 1200s, middle of the 1200s in the Islamic calendar. And I have a book that goes into the details of that. If he wants to send me an email, wisemenofthewest.com. Or wisemenofthewest@gmail.com. I'd be happy to share information on that.
Awesome. So we're running out of time. We're not going to count.
Started.
We're not going to count an hour and the day for a year, because we'd be here for quite a while. And this has been fascinating, Jay. And I've got, sometimes we go well into overtime, but given the relationship that we have, I'd rather have you back than extend this beyond the bounds of prophecy and decency. We prophesied that this would be an hour-long show. I do want to make one comment, though, and that is, somewhere in all this discussion, there was the idea of going back and, correcting something in a book, adding something in a book. But the idea, I think, from the Baha'i faith, not that this is something I've read or seen, but I'm sort of extrapolating here. As God sends his messengers, and this isn't unique to the Baha'i faith, as God sends his messengers, right? The word angel means messenger. As God sends his angels, as God sends his messengers to humankind, even if he's more in the direction of what the deists believe and sort of hands off, of all the things that he would control, that would be the thing that he would control the timing of. You follow me? He would predetermine when, at what point in this unfolding story of humankind with its own free will, he would make the determination of when the catalyst of a new messenger would be introduced into the story. And thus, the specificity of these specific prophetic timelines would be something that he would care about and that he would preordain, even logically, much less to help the believers be able to sort through all these puzzle pieces and perceive this divine hand in a way that skeptics could also say, just coincidence, and you're making it up. You're proof texting history and scripture, which, is a fair perception. It's a fair hypothesis that we're biased and we're just proof texting all this.
Yeah, I never mean to suggest that prophecy alone should be the guide to accepting something. Prophecy is kind of like a flag. On one hill, there may be many hills, and the flag says, come to this hill and take a look more closely.
I mean, like Isaiah, I will set a sign to the nations. I will hoist an ensign, right, on the hill.
Yeah. Then you have to come and look at the actual writings, see if they make spiritual sense, and decide for yourself. But the prophecy is one of the things that maybe helps people, attracts some people, doesn't always attract everybody, but it attracts some people to come and take a serious look.
Yep. I'm going to just throw one more comment in here for Fouad. I don't know if you've ever read Isaac Asimov's Foundation trilogy, but he introduces the concept of psychohistory. And I'm trying to remember the name of the protagonist, Harry something or other. And psychohistory, and it's also similar actually in the novel Dune with Paul Mudd-Dib, and his ability to see the future through like a massive multidimensional chess kind of approach. But with Isaac Asimov, he develops this concept of psychohistory in which, with enough data, you can in fact predict the future. But again, all of that goes out the window when I simply describe God as a being that exists outside of time and space, and therefore he's merely commenting on what choices man made, and then introducing assistance on that journey in the form of messengers. And in addition, the free will of an individual. And you can, Jay, you might comment on this. Maybe you know more about chemistry than I do, but there's like certain catalysts that then cause and trigger a chemical reaction, and then everything behaves a certain way. Human beings in aggregate and in large groups, are similar, and this is what Asimov was getting at with psychohistory, right? you can predict the movement of masses. Karl Marx predicted certain things, right? And Chairman Mao predicted and also controlled certain things with the control of the flow of information. But my point is that an individual can still have free will, even if he's caught in a swelling maelstrom of human activity. Thus, from a prophetic perspective, my analogy that helps me understand this is, if you were in Nazi Germany, you would not have been able to topple Hitler, but you might have been able to save a Jew.
Mm-hmm.
And maybe that's all that matters in terms of your personal free will.
Mm-hmm. And, we never know when something bad happens. Maybe it has something good in the end is going to come out of it. That's one theme that I've seen over and over again. A lot of the most challenging things that happen in a person's life, especially in their young life, turn out to be very beneficial in their the older part of their life as they resolve those difficulties. And I think Wade, you're a perfect example of that.
Yeah, that little kidnapping thing. Yeah. Anyway, we're gonna end with one quick ad and then invite everyone to come back for closing comments. And Jay, be thinking about who you want to give your book to. This next and final ad is an invitation to participate in an anthology. Jay's an author with Something or Other Publishing. This is an invitation to a variety of authors to contribute to this anthology. And there's a little error I noticed in this ad where it says it's by me. It's not by me, it's curated by me. I'll be the curator of this anthology, but your contributions to this anthology are more than welcome. They are being solicited with this ad. Take a look.
The concept of heaven and hell has been a central idea throughout human thought and cultural history. From ancient civilizations to modern religions, people have explored the nature of the afterlife and the potential consequences of their actions during their lifetime. Royal Falcon Press Imprint presents a new project seeking diverse perspectives on the fundamental human theme of heaven and hell. Our goal is to create an anthology that provides readers with a rich and nuanced exploration of heaven and hell throughout human history, inviting writers to draw from a wide range of sources and authors, including religious texts such as the Bible and the Quran, philosophical treatises like Plato's Republic, and modern works like Neil Gaiman's The Sandman series or Michelle Baum's The 5 People You Meet in Heaven. Scan the QR code to submit your contribution to Heaven and Hell by Wade Franson at soupllc.com.
We'll display that QR code for a little longer because we really do want you to access and contribute to this anthology. And you can also just send an email to info@soupllc.com. But Jay, I hope you've taken a moment to be perusing all these wonderful comments by these amazing people and may have picked one and share with us and why.
Well, I've certainly seen several of the comments by Fawad A, and they're certainly worthy of discussion. So I think I would pick him if I had to pick any one person.
Well, Fawad agrees with that. All right, Fawad, I think you know how to contact us. It's good to see you. Hadn't seen you in a while, but I'm really happy to see you tonight. And certainly your comments and input were very helpful to the show. So Dan, Jay, here's your chance. Last words, what you've learned or want to share, thoughts that you have before we sign off for the night.
Well,
Dan,
I'll go first. Yeah, I'll go first, and then I'll leave you with the last word, Jay. I'm excited to have you back. I feel eager to dig into it a little bit more, especially the commonality of the Abrahamic religions. I think that there's something that we didn't really uncover. That they all came from a common thread, and so I'd like to explore that a little bit more.
Yeah, the weave of these things is really unbelievable. Jay, I don't know how many years you've been studying it. As I mentioned, I grew up with it. I've been studying it for 50 years, and oops, did I say that? I mean, 30 years. 20 years. I've been studying it a long time, since I was a young lad. And I just continue to peel back that onion, and layer after layer after layer. Every few months, I'm discovering a new wow epiphany in the incredible depth of this, the weave.
Yeah, and I'm was fascinated, and you'll see it in the book, that there's this connection with the ancient Persian Zoroastrian religion. This, of course, it connects to Christianity because the wise men of the East were Zoroastrian. In fact, the early Bibles don't call them wise men. The early Bibles all refer to them as magi, which was a specific reference to the spiritual class of the Zoroastrians. The Magi and the Zoroastrians drew their religious background. Zoroaster's religious background comes from India and the Vedic scriptures. So Zoroastrian kind of is a
We're
religion.
big into astrology as well, by the way, studying the signs in the heavens, which there's a whole nother layer of how, the star in the east, and how those Magi were able to discern through heavenly signs.
Yeah. So this is, it's a religion that bridges both East and West, and was also expecting a promised one. Zoroaster, who lived about 1,000 years before Christ, he spoke of 3 messengers coming about 1,000 years apart. And obviously we know Jesus was the first one. I understand Muhammad as being the second one. Muhammad and his 12 imams that were divinely guided. That's roughly 1,000 years. And then that brings us 1,000 years further to today. We're 3,000 years away from the time of Zoroaster. So that was very fascinating. In Hinduism, there is at least one prophecy that focuses on the year 1844 specifically. I discovered that as I was doing the research. Buddhism has general concepts, but again, was expecting a fulfillment in the mid-1800s. So there's just a real convergence that comes across and is discovered by my characters as they travel from west to east.
Awesome. Well, thank you, Jay, for joining us. We will have you back. Thank you, the audience. Thank you, Dan. And we will see you all next week, same time, same place. And next week, we have a gentleman named Eric Monshine. Interestingly, Eric Monshine is another published author with Something or Other Publishing. And there's a connection between Jay and Something or Other Publishing through Eric, which we'll probably talk about next week in the interest of time rather than this week. But Eric is also a person of great international experience, and he'll be discussing why this being grounded in history generally, not the history that we spoke of tonight, not prophetic history. It's not really a continuation of this show, but he'll be talking more about the American path through the last couple of centuries, and the role of America in global politics. We won't be talking politics, but the geopolitical place of America, and the idea of nostalgia. Eric's book discusses the time when he grew up, 50s and 60s, in a kind of a nostalgic way, but he'll be looking at the pros and cons of looking back at history and wishing that things were not progressing the way they are, and the role of religion in all of that. So we hope you'll tune in next week to listen to Dr. Eric Monshine, who also was with the New York Bar Association, trained attorney and part of the education system within the New York Bar. So an incredibly well-rounded gentleman who I know you will very much benefit from tuning in to listen to. So thank you, everyone. We'll see you next week.
Thank you.